me, sir.
Well, this is the penultimate episode of Stephen King Month. The next episode will be a review of the new Stephen King's It. But today we're going to be talking about the 1990 miniseries that was produced by ABC back in, 1990. So for those who don't know, Stephen King, It's been around for 27 years, and we're going to share our thoughts on it. So we'll start with Brendan's thoughts, and then I'll get to my thoughts.
Well, I remember when the book came out, and that was about the time I was in junior high, and the size of it, I mean, there's 1,000 pages. At that time, I think it was Stephen King's biggest book. He wrote The Stand, but the editors or somebody decided to make him edit it, and so it came out, I think, with about 800 pages, and then later on they added the other 200 pages or whatever to The Stand, which I read later on. I remember when it came out and looking at the cover, and I was just shocked and gripping, thinking about all the terror and the horror, and at that time, horror was huge in the 80s. There was Freddy Krueger and Jason and Michael Myers and Chucky, and so I think that this was Stephen King's attempt to bring out something really horrific. Pennywise the Clown. Mm-hmm. It really stuck in people's minds.
Right. And part of that too was the fact that only a couple years, or about 5 years prior to the book's release, there was John Wayne Gacy, the infamous Pogo the Clown, who killed tons and tons of kids. And that was still kind of fresh in America's mind because at the time it was a huge case, alongside, Jeffrey Dahmer and whatnot. Probably not as big as Jeffrey Dahmer, but it still kind of lent itself to an inspiration towards the creature of Pennywise. It was kind of an influence. And the fact that as natural as clowns may be, and despite what the clown union may say about the new Stephen King's It movie, clowns are still scary, regardless if you're nice or evil. Just saying.
And spoiler alert for anybody that's not familiar with it, he's not actually a clown, or the thing is not a clown, it's an alien spider that makes you think you're seeing an evil clown.
Right. Because, it's the stupidest reveal ever. But, the book itself has a lot more deeper insight to its own universe. And when you're trying to translate it into a miniseries like the one we're talking about today, there's bound to be a lot of leaps in logic that don't make any sense. And the miniseries, definitely with the spider, definitely did not make sense. And even in the live-action movie that we're getting, I don't think they'll ever touch on the cosmic stuff. For one reason, and that is, it would be a displacement in tone. Because if you're, there's been many sci-fi horror movies that could blend it together, but because it was introduced as kind of a clown character in the beginning that could shapeshift, it made no sense later in the book that it would be an alien creature. It would be a total displacement from everything else. And if it was to be adapted into a movie, I don't think it would resonate well with audiences. The one thing I could say is, maybe the Thing could come close to being a Pennywise-type character. It is a shapeshifter, after all, but it's not the shapeshifter we know from the book or in the miniseries. But
at the same time, they do not go into depth explaining what the Thing is.
Right.
It's just only the horror, the effect of the Thing.
Yeah, and I think that also by giving Pennywise a backstory like the alien thing, it creates not just more questions, but it also takes away, I feel, a little bit of the paranoia of the character. Because when we read the book and we watch the miniseries, all we know is that it can shapeshift into any different types of creatures that may scare a child or an adult or whatnot. But once you establish a backstory for these characters, like Pennywise or even some of the other great villains of history, you start to lose some of the scariness of it. Like, the reason why the original Alien worked was that it didn't have the backstory. The fact that it came from an unknown place was where we got the terror. Because you don't know where it is. You don't know where it came from. You're just like, oh my god, where did it come from? That's essentially Pennywise in a nutshell in the first half of the book. And then it kind of delineates itself in the rest of the half. I feel, at least. So yeah, this is... So we're going to talk about part 1 of the miniseries, and I think it's the strongest part of the miniseries. It's not the best written part, well, neither is the second part, but the first part has a little bit more going on for it. And one of my hopes for the new movie is that it just sticks with the kids. Because all we got for character development for the Losers Club is just like, oh, we're going to build a dam, and then, oh yeah, we're all friends now. You know, that's one scene, and it just kind of like... It's like, where's the build-up to the camaraderie between the group? There's not a lot of that. The only other scene where I could see, like, character progression as, you know, they start to establish their friendship was with Mike Hanlon. That's right. Mike Hanlon's character. Like, when Mike goes to the construction shop and starts, like, the Losers Club just defends them from Henry Bowers' character and his group, which has become kind of a trope, too. It's like you get this whole group of greasers and whatnot. I've seen it in so many Stephen King stories. They defend him as a sort of way to build character, I guess.
Well, and you got to think, you know, Stephen King, he had a rough upbringing. I think his dad was not involved in his life whatsoever,
Right.
And his mom was pretty poor, and even the first part of his life with his wife, they were pretty poor. I mean, he was an English teacher. They worked in a laundromat. He wrote just bits and pieces, and you know, they scraped by. And he was a huge hippie when he was in college, and so he's got this. You know, he was definitely very nerdy, and all these characters. I felt like my life was like all. If I took all the characters and I put them together, that would be kind of me. I never had asthma, but I definitely was a Boy Scout. I was a nerd. I liked writing. In fact, after I read it, there was an English assignment, and I was supposed to write like a 20-page story. I wrote my own version of it, which ended up being like 30 pages. I only got like a C+ or whatever, but you know, it was definitely pretty important when it came out, and all those characters, I can see myself in a little bit of each one for some reason.
Yeah, because, like, the losers themselves kind of represent the archetypes of what could be considered, like, losers. You know, you get the fat kid, you get the nerd, you get the guy with the stutter, you get the girl that's kind of awkward.
The girl that one kid likes and the other kid, that she likes him. So it's like the triangle.
You got a love triangle. Like, basically, the Losers Club is the prototype for what Stranger Things is today. You have that
even the music kind of reminded me. I thought Stranger Things was basically trying to borrow that kind of same music, you know, from that kind of era.
Mm-hmm. I think the one thing in part 1, at least, that kind of dilutes the actual storytelling is the unnecessary flashbacks. If we had just kept the adults out of the first part, there would be a little bit more tension as, you know, like let's say you have all these characters as adults, and they all flash back to when they were kids. It takes all the suspense out of who's going to live and who's going to die. I found that, like, as a storytelling element, there's certain storytelling elements you just don't do, and the flashback kind of delineates any tension from any scene, because you already know where they're going to be. Except for Stan, but that's neither here nor there. But just, again, I have problems with the flashbacks in the first part of this movie.
I thought the first part that was really like in your face, and like here's one person, then bam, goes back to their past, and then bam, here they are now, and then the next person, and then the next person. And I was like, it was kind of jarring, and maybe the book, I read the book, I can't remember, it was so long ago, but I'm sure the book was a little bit more, if you got to know the characters and stuff. But at the same time, when they show you who they are now versus who they were back then, who they are now, they went on to become famous, and they did awesome things.
Right.
And it's bizarre, like, and you know that what they faced as a kid, they went on to defeat all these things that were in their way.
Right. And a lot, the biggest theme of it is the necessity of growing up, pretty much. When you really think about it, all these characters have something in their way, an obstacle that keeps them from growing up. The biggest example is Beverly Marsh and her fear of actual womanhood. Like, all of her fears stem from her sexuality, her dilemma with love and relationship. And that's one of the biggest things for someone is actually puberty. You know, having that fear of growing up too fast and becoming an adult, and your childhood's just kind of waning away. You know, all your imagination, all your different loves and likes and dislikes are just going to slowly fade away. And it is kind of a reminder of that. It feeds on the childhood. You know, I think you can kind of piece together the parts here, but Pennywise is basically the eater of worlds and children. Worlds could be meaning like what you would imagine as a child, and your childhood gets eaten up by the past, and you no longer have that childhood anymore. But then again, Pennywise just eats kids, so yeah, you don't really advance from that. I think the biggest strength of the first part of this miniseries is the actual character writing. The kids are really well performed by some of their actors.
Yeah.
Jonathan Brandis unfortunately passed away a couple years after this movie. But most of the actors in this do a pretty good job in the first part, except for a couple side characters, but that's pretty much here or there. The acting is probably the best part of this first part. And Pennywise, played by Tim Curry, has kind of been the most iconic thing. Even though it's not very book accurate in terms of the brutality of the character or how unnecessarily funny they made the character, he still kind of holds a place in everyone's hearts because he's been the symbol of Pennywise for 27 years. Like, it's like how fans were kind of pissed off with the Nightmare on Elm Street remake, where Jackie Earle Haley was Freddy Krueger instead of Robert Englund. There's a lot of reasons as to why Tim Curry's Pennywise stays in the hearts of so many. Not just because he's a good actor, but because he's iconic as the role. But there's one thing I question, is that every time I talk about this movie with people, they say, "Oh, it is so scary. It's a scary movie." I don't think it's that scary. I mean, when you really look at it, Pennywise serves no threat. He doesn't really threaten the kids. All he does is just, like, spout out of nowhere and talks about his balloon fetish and just pisses off. You know, that's all he does. There's no threat from this character. But what I do think about why this character is the way he is because I'm trying to think of why people I talk to think that he's scary. Maybe it's a
there's
possibility.
people that just don't like clowns.
Well, yeah, there's a reason. Like, people may just not like clowns.
Or the drain, when you stick your arm in the drain and he's got the menacing teeth.
Right.
That's kind of creepy, you know.
But that's like towards the beginning of the film.
Yeah.
But like later on, he really doesn't have anything threatening to do.
Just the blood. I don't know.
Yeah, there's really nothing threatening that he truly does. He just makes idle threats and just bugs off. He's like an internet troll at this point in the entire movie. I think the reason why people find him so scary in the miniseries is the possibility of him actually existing. Like, while we as humans try to have our own sort of way of thinking what would the possibilities be that he could have done. And because of the limited budget that this TV special had, I think where Pennywise in this miniseries may come off as scary is that we fill in the blanks of what is scary. You know, it's like the Jaws effect. You don't really know what the Jaws looks like. You don't know what the shark fully looks like, but you can kind of piece together in your head what it must have been like for the victim to be eaten by the shark. You can kind of piece that together, but then again, it's kind of a weaker argument to why this movie doesn't really work.
Another thing I noticed was, again, one of the main characters is an author that is very common throughout Stephen King's books. He's basically putting his life in there, which is, as a great writer, you should write what you know. What he knows is having a character as an author in there. But this one is a horror writer, and starts out as a kid writing books or stories, and I felt that this was definitely, he was paralleling or letting people know what was going on in his life, because also the success of the author is being displayed in this. It's not a struggling author, it's somebody who's a bestseller, and at the time Stephen King, was having drug problems, and he was enjoying his success. He was making, there's tons of movies coming out, the books were just rolling out. He was in his prime.
But yeah, in part one essentially ends with the kids just being like, hey, if this thing ever comes back, we're gonna come back with guns and fire ammo, whatever. We're gonna take this motherfucker out.
And they totally forgot the machine gun.
They totally forgot the machine gun and, and everything else. And it fully ends with probably one of the best sort of screams of no before Darth Vader said it in Revenge of the Sith. Stan's wife comes into the bathroom and all you see is just Stan doing this in the bathtub, and you see it just scrawled in there, probably the most vague of messages ever. It's just it. I don't know what else to think. I'm gonna die. Blech. And she drops a can of beer or something like that, and she goes, "Ah!" It's the most corniest and cheesiest of no's I've ever heard of until Revenge of the Sith in 2003. There's been a bunch of
That scene wasn't very good.
It wasn't very good, no. And that no is basically the indicator to turn off the TV, because the second part is just needlessly stupid and just boring for the most part.
I can get over the fact that it was limited budget, and so when you finally get to see the spider thing, which doesn't quite resemble what's in the book when I read it, or even the lair for that matter, in the book tells you kind of what's going on with the portal. I'm okay with the spider monster at the end, even though it's really cheesy now. I definitely see the potential for something awesome in the next movie, or if they're going to have a two-parter.
Well, I mean, they are going to have a two-parter. They've already confirmed that this new version of it will be in two parts. The first part is the Losers Club, and then the second part is them all grown up in 2016. Yeah, they're probably going to do some time-bending bullshit, but
I think the worst part about the second part is there's just not much to it. They finally get reunited, and it's good to see that. They have this big Chinese food party, and they're just enjoying themselves and drinking, getting drunk. And hey, I had my 20-year reunion not that long ago, and it was pretty fun. And so you see the people that you grew up with. These are the people who are your friends. After you go to college, you go on into your life, people disappear, your best friends are the ones that you made, in junior high and grade school,
Yeah. And the biggest problem with the second part is just it's so boring. Every scene is either them talking or Pennywise acting like a doofus. If for those of you who've seen all my intro for Stephen King Month, I obviously put in the stupid, ha 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 ha. I just figured that maybe the director was like, okay, Tim Curry, we don't really have anything for you scary in this scene, so why don't you just do some mad-libbing in this scene? And I bet you 10 to 1 he came to set drunk and just did that scene. And it's probably the most entertaining scene of the second part of this special. But then it gets back to mediocrity and balloons and like the biggest trouble of the second part is that they try to make balloons scary, and it's not. Like I could see what they were trying to do. It's like, oh, the balloon is a marker for Pennywise. Pennywise is near them. The balloon's there. But then when they're in the library and they open the fridge door to find Stan's head in there, there's a bunch of freaking balloons that come out of it. It's like, it's not very subtle. It's just like, oh yeah, Pennywise is here, Pennywise is here. Here, take all this confetti, balloons. Balloons! But yeah, and the biggest problem essentially with this entire movie, because it's presented as a movie and not as a series, is the fact that it's overly long. It's 3 hours, and you could cut some of the filler out from the second part and just make it cohesive. And that was the biggest problem I had with Salem's Lot, essentially, was, again, because it was presented as a movie, I have to judge it as a movie and not as a miniseries. When it's cut together as a movie, you have a lot of pacing issues, and there's pacing issues in the first part, but the second part of Stephen King's It is the most flatline of pacing ever. Just flatline at that point. I mean, at least the second part has, like, some heartbeats in it, you know? Every time it beats, there's, like, the childhood parts. But here, it's just bland.
Yeah, what I thought about the first part was you had the character development with the kids, which was cool, and then, which Stephen King excels at, you know, like Stand By Me. And then you have the kids getting picked on, you know, because they're losers, and you know you got the bullies, which bullies are everywhere, and it's unfortunate. And then the Pennywise shows up, and you get this, you know, ow, this is kind of tense, you know, and it just does that over and over again. But the second part is just party, you know, and kind of bland, and then
yeah,
and then the spider thing at the end.
Yeah, and then Henry Bowers comes back in the form of Matlock. Like we needed that character. I don't know. Apparently he's in a mental institution.
That was weird. That was
yeah,
so weird.
Like Pennywise appears to him in the moon, like he's Boogie Woogie in Nightmare Before Christmas.
It felt unnecessary. Totally unnecessary.
It's an unnecessary character. I'm aware that he's in the book in the second part, but golly, do you really need that character? And the way they break him out, too, is so stupid. Like, this guard just comes up, he drops this thing of quarters, he looks up, like, there's like this Pennywise clown thing, and then his head's a Rottweiler for some reason. I'm like, what the hell is this? That's not scary. That's just downright hilarious. That's like dogs playing poker level of funny. Like, seriously. It's not scary. It's just stupidly funny that if you were to get drunk, you'd probably have the best time in your life. You could just play the Nostalgia Critic drinking game for this movie and just, I mean, granted, don't do it all the time because you'll probably die of alcohol poisoning because of so many tropes of Stephen King. But the biggest problem with part 2 and part 1 is that essentially it's not scary. Most of it is just either uncomfortably funny or just kind of needlessly funny. But the second part definitely is the worst disappointment because you don't get a lot of good character stuff. Yeah,
I preferred the characters to be kids, and when they became adults, it was kind of lame.
Yeah, and that's the biggest reason why Stranger Things is such a popular thing nowadays, is that it focuses on a time in the life of people where they're the most vulnerable. And the best relatable heroes is when they're most vulnerable. You know, like one of the biggest action stars of all time, Bruce Willis, played John McClane. And there was parts in the first movie where you could see that he was very, very vulnerable. Well, what's the most vulnerable person at their worst? It's when they're children. And that's what made us so enthralled with the kids in Stranger Things, and possibly even with the new film, is that as kids, you could feel that they are invulnerable. And we've been there. We can relate to that. But as adults, we don't tend to be as vulnerable as kids.
Besides the fact that when they're adults, some of them are kind of really annoying.
Yeah.
That's what they came
like
off to me.
Yeah, like sometimes when you grow up to be an adult, you just turn in. Sometimes you can turn into an annoying little prick.
But then they were trying to become. Well, they were relating. Well, they were doing a. Okay, well, I kind of think that adults are just older versions of their child selves, kind of.
Right.
And so then they got together. They kind of regressed back to being adults who were remembering that they were kids and they were acting like kids. And I can understand that too, but
right.
it was kind of cheesy.
Yeah, it's just yeah, the whole thing when we really sum it up, the entire movie, it's cheesy, overbloated, and has one of the most disappointing endings of all time. Like one of the disappointing reveals. Granted, it's not as stupid as like the Langoliers, where it's like giant sausage testicle things with teeth, or
I don't know why they made that. It was good in the short story, but when I heard it was coming out, I was like, how are they gonna pull this off?
With Terrible's 90s CGI.
With really bad CGI. That's of course how it was.
I mean, the one thing I can give the spider credit is that it kind of looks interesting. It's a puppet, and it has stop motion.
It gets the lights
on the belly,
or on Trance, the characters. That was kind of cool.
Yeah, and just like, and some of the stop motion in this film is a bit dated. Like when Pennywise is defeated in the first part, you can obviously tell it's very bad stop motion.
I kind of liked it.
I mean, yeah, like it has its charm because it's in the 90s and it's a very limited budget. Originally, this miniseries was supposed to be in 8 parts, 8 hours total, and you probably could have covered a little bit more ground there. But because the studio, ABC, did not want it that long, they wanted it 3.5 hours long, and the budget wasn't there, you really couldn't capture anything of what made the original so scary. And that's the biggest problem with it. It's not a very faithful adaptation. Despite some of the similarities to the books, especially with the childhood portions, you can't really capture the same sort of scariness as the original book. In which I do hope that the movie is like that, and I've been reading some critics' responses on Twitter or whatnot. It's like, oh yeah, Pennywise is scary, it's subtle, and it's not jump scary like the trailers. I hope it's not jump scary, because that's the worst part about modern horror films, is that it relies too much on false jump scares, and you don't have that.
It seems like today's horror movies just aren't working. I stopped watching some of it. It's just they're garbage. I mean,
there's every once in a blue moon you'll get a good horror movie.
Every once in a while.
But nowadays, most horror movies are either relegated to January, which is the garbage movie month, or they're direct-to-video.
Well, I just wanted to say that, I've seen a lot of Stephen King, and I've seen a lot of the television stuff. I mean, Storm of the Century, and the one where the guy gets younger, I can't remember what that one was called. Golden Years.
Golden Years, yeah.
Or Golden Days, or whatever. And,
GoldenEye.
The Langoliers was on TV. What was the other one? Tommy Knockers, that was made for TV.
Oh god, Tommy Knockers.
Yeah, but this is actually one of the better ones, which is kind of shows you how bad the Stephen King television stuff was.
Yeah.
Nightmares and Dreamscapes, in my opinion, is the best. And when I rented that, I was like, man, I'd love to buy this. This is like Twilight Zone kind of level of good. But
yeah.
And then the 11/22/63 is classic too. I would say I put that right below.
Yeah.
So it is good, but as to look at all the other stuff is garbage, and it is just the first part is better.
For me, like when it first starts and you see like the classic like opening stuff for Stephen King's It from the book, you're like, oh, I'm so pumped, and then the rest just kind of like arcs and then goes downhill from there. So for me, it's not one of my favorites. It definitely has a nostalgic place because I used to watch it as a kid and I was kind of scared of Pennywise, and nowadays I'm like, it's not that scary. It doesn't really have that lasting impact as I did with like Freddy Krueger. Because like Freddy Krueger can at least go into your dreams Pennywise, for me, never really was too scary when I grew up. So it didn't really have that lasting impact, and that was mostly due to the overly, like, a lot of just terrible pacing and just drawn out scenes that probably could have been cut better. But I can understand it because it's a made-for-TV miniseries, and they had limitations, and I could understand that from a historical perspective. But if it were to be made today, it'd be critically panned. It would just be flat out just like, this is garbage. I don't know if it would get a worse score than the Emoji Movie. It'd probably get a better score than the Emoji Movie or The Dark Tower, but it would still be kind of panned if it was made like this today. But in total, for me, if I was to give it a rating, it'd probably be a D+. It has its perks, and it has its sort of charms, but overall, it's just not a very great movie.
I think the first part, to me, is like a B, but after that, the last part is so D that it brings the B down to the, near the D.
Yeah.
So the first part, not bad. At least it tells a story. It's entertaining. I like the kids. Blah blah blah. And then the last part's like nothing.
Yeah. So this is the sort of second to last Stephen King review that I'm doing this month. At the time of this recording, I've reviewed almost 70 different Stephen King stuff. I may not be exactly accurate with that number. Anyone can fact check me on that one. But I've had a lot of Stephen King stuff, and hopefully I could get back to more, just like stuff in the movie theaters, and yeah. So thank you everyone so much for watching this video. It's been a great time discussing Stephen King's It. And I hope that the new movie is better. It kind of looks like it's going to be, but we'll have to wait and see. So, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.
See you. Thank you.